Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to chapter 5. This is talking about evolution, and I feel like I say this literally every single unit. But chapter 5, evolution and ecosystems, is one of my all-time favorite units because we're talking about all the different adaptations, the changes that happen to different organisms and within ecosystems. It's action-packed. We're talking about the methods of evolution. We're talking about the pacing of evolution, and get all into the good tips and tricks. I'm going to try to speak English. Sorry, guys. Let's get into it, though. As we get started today, I want to first kind of refresh with you guys what exactly is biodiversity. We've talked about this earlier. Remember, we break apart this word: bio meaning life, diversity meaning variety. We're looking at all the different traits, different organisms, different ecosystems in a given area. I'm really looking at a measurement of how diverse or varietal is a given area. So what is biodiversity? It's the variety of life. And there's three main ways that we're going to be measuring biodiversity within this course. One of those is ecosystem diversity. Obviously, this is the broadest form because we're talking about an entire ecosystem in the regions, how many different types of areas there are in a given region. So I like this picture here. We've got the nice rain shadow effect, right? Remember, we've got my windward side, which is a lush and moist and fruitful, and then we have my leeward side where it's a little bit drier, hotter, and more arid. So looking at this given region, right, I've got an aquatic, I have an open ocean, I have a tributary, a stream ecosystem, I've got some forests, I have some rocky areas, I've got some arid, so a whole bunch of different ecosystems within a given region. We also have species diversity. So whenever I'm looking at a given ecosystem, when I'm looking at the ocean, when I'm looking at grasslands, when I'm looking at tundras, right? When I'm looking at a given ecosystem, how many different species are there? The ecosystems that have a greater amount of species would have a greater biodiversity than ecosystems that have very few species. And there's a whole bunch of different abiotic and biotic conditions that are going to cause that. We'll talk about that later today. Finally, we can also look at diversity in terms of genetic diversity within individual species. So I'm looking at monstera plants, or I'm looking at tropical fish. Whatever species I'm looking at, what are the different varieties of genes? So I'm looking at variations of traits. I'm looking at different subspecies or subbreeds. I'm looking at all the different traits and all the ways that they can manifest within different individuals. Species that have a lot of diversity within it means that they have a lot of different traits. We're going to have greater biodiversity than a species that is pretty mono suited, right? All the organisms in that area don't show a lot of variety. They're all kind of the same thing. So that would be a low biodiversity within that species. All right. How do we exactly measure biodiversity? We talked about this earlier in class. It is very difficult to measure exactly how many species there are because there's some parts of the world that are very difficult to access. We're only able to access, let's say, the very, very bottom of the ocean floor. That is a very select group of individuals, and they can't just be there all the time. Same thing with, let's say, like the top of Mount Everest, right? Not everybody can access that. And so some areas are very difficult for us to be able to measure exactly how many species. Also, organisms are always being born and always dying. So in order for us to kind of figure out biodiversity, we're going to be estimating, right? We talked about this earlier in class when we talked about population sampling. Oftentimes what we're going to do is we're going to look at a given area, figure out how many species and what is the exact composition of the different organisms there in a given area, multiply that by the total amount of area, and that kind of gives us a rough estimate of exactly how many species there are. So at this time, scientists estimate that there are approximately 10 million species on Earth. Man, kind of amazing when you think about that. So a whole bunch of insects is probably the biggest composition of that percentage, but there's a lot of insects, there's a lot of plants, animals. It's amazing, all the different biodiversity on this world. There's two ways that we can then go ahead and translate or describe that biodiversity of a given region. One of those is species richness, and one of those is species evenness. And it's very important for you guys to be able to distinguish between these two and use these interchangeably. And I feel like they're very easily mixed up. So make sure to pay attention or take some good notes on the slide. Species richness, strictly speaking, is how many species there are in a given area. So I have two communities here. I have community 1 on the left, I have community 2 on the right. Species richness, or the number of species in a given area, is equal for these two different regions, right? Community 1 has tree species A, tree species B, tree species C, and tree species D. And same thing with community 2. They both have A, B, C, and D. So if I was trying to tell you about community 1 versus community 2, I would say that these two populations, or these two communities, I should say, have the exact same equal amounts of species richness. They have the same amount of organisms depending on which one you're looking at, right? Species evenness, though, is telling me, looking at the composition of those species there, how equal in percentage-wise or proportion-wise are these different species in comparison to one another. So looking at community 1 would have a very high evenness because species A, B, C, and D all roughly make about, or in this instance, they make exactly the same amount. They are all 25% of the area or 25% of the community. So that is a very high species evenness. Community 2 has a very low species evenness because I have one species, species A, that is dominating the area. 70% of the whole area is just species A. B, C, and D are only 10%. And if you really look at it, I mean, you can see that I've just got like a couple, like 2 of, I don't know, species C over there. But really, we're being dominated by species A. So this would be very low evenness because I have a very disproportionate amount of species in community 2. So some areas can be same richness but different evenness, or maybe they could have the same evenness but different richness, right? So it depends on what you were looking at, but I would definitely be familiar with these terms. They sometimes come up on like quizzes and tests and stuff like that. Oh, I love this picture. This kid's going places. He's got the headphone jack, and there's the headphones. Okay. So when we're talking about evolutionary relationships among species, hopefully, if you were paying attention in biology a couple years ago, this should look very familiar. If you've never seen this before, don't worry. They are one of my all-time favorite things. This is a phylogeny. In particular, this is the phylogenetic tree. Phylogeny is the branching patterns of evolutionary relationships. Essentially gives us a way to visualize how different species may have evolved over time. It also tells us maybe the order of how different traits may have come about in an ecosystem, depending on the different species and the relatedness between species. But one of the greatest things that our phylogenetic trees can tell us is genetically speaking and trait-wise, how more closely some individuals are related to each other than compared to others. So in this one, I'm seeing organisms that are more closely together on a phylogenetic tree are going to be more closely related than individuals that are very far apart. So my lizard and my chipmunk are the two most closely related organisms because they're on the same, what we call a node, or they're on the same branch, whereas my chipmunk and my lancelet are very distantly related. Organisms, just to kind of give you the rundown, the little quick and skinny, I don't know what you cool kids say of how to read these things. We're looking at time from the bottom all the way up to the top. We're also looking at the traits. So organisms have any traits that are below them on a phylogenetic tree. So my lamprey, if I follow him down, a lamprey has vertebrae and notochords, but a lamprey does not have a hinged jaw, 4 legs, or mammary glands, because all of those things evolved after the evolution of the lamprey. My chipmunk friend over here, though, he has all of these traits because all these traits evolved, if I'm looking at that evolutionary time on the left-hand side, before the evolution of the chipmunk. If this is not ringing any bells, I would maybe take a look at this part in your textbook. Phylogenetic trees show us that evolutionary relatedness. Oh, we got joke time. Man, so many jokes today. What do you call, well, sorry, I forgot to cover up the answer, but what do you call a person dog? It's a popsicle. I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions when we get to this part of the chapter about what exactly evolution is. And I will hear students say, oh yes, like an organism that learns how to do something evolved. And I would say no. The reason being is that evolution in the strictest sense is the change in a population over time. And that keyword, and I bolded it because population is very important. Evolution does not occur at an individual organism level. Evolution is occurring at a population or species level, okay? in the strictest sense, I'm looking at an individual species or an individual population, which is made up of the same individuals of the same species, and I'm looking at the genetic makeup of all those organisms, right? And when I'm looking at the genetic makeup, I'm trying to figure out how are my proportions of different genetic traits changing over time. If there's no evolution, that means I'm going to have all the same traits, and the same traits are going to have the exact same proportion in the population over time. It's not going to change. But if I start seeing certain traits increase in proportion in the area or decrease, that would be what we would refer to as evolution. Okay, it's the changing of proportion of traits in a population of organisms of the same species. And there's two ways that evolution can occur. We have micro, think micro small, like a microscope, microevolution, and we also have macroevolution. So you can also think if you're taking economics, or if that's something you're taking later, there's micro versus macroeconomics. Microevolution, small, is happening below the species level. So we're looking at different variations of individuals within the same species. So in this one, I think of apples, okay? Apples have 1,000, not really, a lot of different varieties, right? There's like Fiji apples, and there's Gala apples, and there's Granny Smith apples, okay? So all the ways that we have these different apples has occurred via microevolution. It's happening within one species. I also think about dogs. Holy cow, there are so many types of dogs, but all dogs are the same species, right? They're all dogs, but we have different breeds of dogs. And how we got those different breeds within one individual species is microevolution. And contrast macroevolution, whoa, big. Macroevolution is whenever we have new species being formed, also known as speciation, the creation of new species. So whenever I'm having, let's say I have an apple, and then the apple creates a completely new fruit that evolved from the apple, and I've created a new species of fruit that originated from the apple, but now it's a completely new species. This is now referred to as macroevolution, or the creation of a new species. And I did want to say, how do we distinguish, like, okay, why let's say, I can't think of any dogs right now. Why is a Great Dane and a Pit Bull considered not different species? Well, it's because they can still mate and produce viable or living offspring that are fertile, okay? That is the definition of a species, right? A species is an individual organism that have similar traits, they have similar morphology, but a key part of what defines an individual as being part of the same species is, can they make fertile living offspring, okay? So whenever I talk about this, a lot of people will bring up a zonkey, okay? So a zonkey is a real thing, right? A zebra and a donkey have a baby, and it's what we call a zedonk or a zonkey, okay? But that is not a species. A zonkey is not a species because zonkeys actually have an odd number of chromosomes. And so they are, in all sense of the word, sterile, okay? Zonkeys cannot make more zonkeys. A zonkey and a zonkey, this is ridiculous. A zonkey and a zonkey can't make babies. So that's why a zebra and a donkey are considered two different species. Yes, they can make a kid, but their kid is sterile. Their kid is not able to produce new species. So zebra and donkey are different species, okay? But a chihuahua, I know this from personal example, a chihuahua and a greyhound can make a baby, and then that chihuahua greyhound baby can make more babies. And so that's why a chihuahua and a greyhound are considered being part of the same species, because they can make a kid, and that kid is able to reproduce. If that makes sense, hopefully, I'd be happy to explain this more in class, but that is the definition of species, and that hopefully helps you distinguish, is this an example of microevolution or is this an example of macroevolution? Okay, there are two chosen ways that evolution can happen, or two non-random ways that evolution can happen. We're going to talk about these two non-random ways that evolution happens, cut the video off, and then we'll do a part 2 where we talk about the non-random ways. Well, excuse me, these are the non-random. We're going to talk about the random ways in our next video. Artificial selection, if you're not familiar with the term, it is a good thing for you guys to be familiar with. Artificial selection is when humans are the ones who are making this evolution, or determining how or which individuals are going to be reproducing. We are the ones in charge, which makes it non-random. It is forced, okay? So the way that I always think about it, we were talking about dogs earlier. Dogs is a huge example of an artificial selection, right? I want to make, all dogs came from a wolf, okay? And all the different individual dog breeds, right? Not species, but all the different individual dog breeds are going to be coming about because humans chose and favored different traits, picked organisms that show those traits and had them reproduce. And over many, 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 many years, we now have different breeds of dogs. Some that are just for comfort, right? They are not going to survive in the woods, but man, they do a really good job of giving me comfort and love and affection. Some dogs are protection dogs. They're really, really good. They're strong, right? They're muscular and they're kind of scary. So they're very good at protecting. Those were chosen traits that were artificially selected for by humans that has created these individual species. Some dogs are worker dogs. Some dogs are herding dogs. We see all these different favoring and selection of traits that we as humans deemed as important. We chose different organisms or different individuals to reproduce, which over many years created different breeds, right? Another one, oh no, that mustard seed is the ancestor of all these delicious vegetables. So whenever we're looking at the wild mustard seed, we had individual mustards breed or cross-pollinate that we thought had favorable things. So ones that had really, really luscious leaves, I reproduce, and the luscious leaves gave me cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, right? But some that had really strong root system and stems, and these bulbs are going to create Brussels sprouts, which is favoring the bulb part. Kohlrabi is looking at the roots itself. So all these different vegetables came from wild mustard. When we're looking at wild mustard organisms that had certain traits that we liked, we had those cross-pollinate, and over time we've created these different species of vegetables, which is actually very, very cool. So artificial selection is non-random, it is by choice, but it is by humans making the choice. We also have natural selection, and I promise we are almost done. In natural selection, the environment or nature chooses. I always think natural selection, nature chooses. So the ecosystem itself, the conditions that are in an area, is what's actually influencing which individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. Individuals have a whole bunch of variety of traits. In individual species, we see a lot of variety of traits. The different traits that we refer to as adaptations or give them kind of like an edge, makes them better able to survive. Individuals that have adaptations that make them better able to survive are going to be the ones that actually live, make babies. And then those babies are going to be having the traits that helps their parents better able to survive. We call this natural selection. So I'm looking at this picture over here on the left-hand side. We're looking at different organisms. And this crustacean known as an amphipod, parents produce offspring that vary in size. The ones that are going to be smaller are going to be ones that are better able to hide away from predators. We've got this big old fish that likes to eat the crustaceans. So the ones that were too big were easily seen. Those were the ones that were cut out. However, the individuals that were favorable, that had the smaller size, they were better able to hide. That was an adaptation that allowed them to survive, reproduce. When they make babies, now we have a population that has more and more of individuals with the smaller body size. So this happens over and over again until when I'm looking at my starting population versus my final population after many generations have gone by, I see that overall my final population, I see more individuals that have the favorable trait of being a smaller size. Fitness is another term that you should be familiar with in this section. Fitness is the ability of an individual to survive, reproduce, and pass down genes, right? It's not like working out fitness. It's like how better able you're able to survive in an area. So the combination of traits that allow for survival is our adaptations, okay? Last thing, and then I promise we are ending. Always like bragging to you guys about this textbook. I love this textbook so much, but I'm telling you guys, one of the key successes of this class is actually reading the textbook. And I know you guys are very, very busy, but we spend like at least a week and a half on each chapter. So break it up. If it's 20 pages, read 3 to 4 pages a day, right? So definitely take that time to read the textbook. One thing in particular that our textbook goes over for chapter 5 is genotype versus phenotype. I didn't go over it too much in here, if at all, because a lot of that is reviewed from biology. But definitely if you need to brush up on those brush up on genotype, brush up on phenotype, recombination, mutations, all that good stuff is in the first half of chapter 5. Otherwise, I'm leaving you guys today with a riddle. If you have me, you want to share me. If you share me, you haven't got me. What am I? Ha, 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 ha. I hope you guys have an amazing day, and I will see you guys in class. Thank you guys so much.